In this episode, we talk about the Gini Index, according to which India is one of the most equal societies today. We also talk about the passing of one of Kerala's tallest political figures, Comrade VS Achuthanandan. But first, we talk about the issue of flooding and waterlogging in Gurgaon. Hi, I am Niharika Nanda, and you are listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Flooded roads in Gurgaon during the monsoon have become something of a tradition now. Each year, we see visuals of waterlogged streets, long lines of traffic stretching for hours, residential societies inundated, and in some tragic cases, people even getting electrocuted. So how did one of India's wealthiest urban centers and IT hubs end up being so vulnerable to rain? When we spoke to the Indian Express's Shiny Varghese, who writes on urban development, she first told us the story of how the region of Gurgaon became the Gurugram that we know today.
So Gurgaon, if we break up the word, is Guru and Gram. And legend has it that Guru Dronacharya was, lived here, although a lot of historians don't agree with that. But it's what the people in that village have begun to believe, and it's become part of urban legend perhaps. But that's from where Guru Gram gets its name.
She says the area was once a collection of villages where people mainly engaged in dairy farming rather than agriculture.
So when in the 1980s, or rather late 70s, when Sanjay Gandhi, being the son of the then Prime Minister, he wanted to build India's first car, the smallest car, and he came to Gurgaon and said that, okay, this is where we will start a factory. Actually, initially he said Faridabad, but then Faridabad just seemed too far away, so Gurugram happened.
So through Sanjay Gandhi's initiative, Maruti entered into a partnership with the Japanese company Suzuki, and that's how Gurgaon began its transformation into a hub for automobile manufacturing.
So around the 1980s is where Maruti began its factories, and subsequently, therefore, you needed residences, and with that, everything else started, slowly falling into place. And with Sanjay Gandhi coming in, there was this DLF, what is otherwise called as the Delhi Land and Finance Company. They were already building in Delhi. So they had built horse cars and Kailash Colony. All these colonies were already built by them, and I think they went broke. So they had to look for new places where they could build, and this just seemed like the right place for them to come and set up shop.
Shiny says that instead of approaching the government for land, DLF began directly asking the farmers if they were interested in selling their land.
So they started acquiring land from farmers. They didn't go to the government, really. One would imagine that, you go to the government and say, I want land. But they went directly to the farmers and, said, will you sell me your land? I want to build, this great residential complex that will come up. And so they started getting farmers in, and I think about 52 villages, again, what people call the largest land grab, but basically the largest accumulation of land that ever happened in post-independence India happened when DLF entered Gurgaon. And with that, other real estate people came in, like the Rahejas and the Ansals. They all came in as well. And today, Gurgaon is, from this mythical city of being Guru Dronacharya's city, it became the millennial city as we know it in the 21st century.
And Shiny, the reason we are talking about Gurgaon today is because once again last week, we saw roads in the region getting massively flooded. How long has this been a problem for Gurgaon?
Pretty much since the time that the road started getting built. Now, Gurgaon, if you look at it topographically, and I happen to see a map from 1920s, which shows Gurgaon, that is Delhi, Punjab and the provinces around. And in the Gurgaon area particularly, you get to see these tiny rivulets. So Gurgaon is not really fertile in that way. Like how you would find an Amravati, which has the river and, that's fertile farmland. Gurgaon was not so much as a agricultural fertile plot of land, but it had a lot of these small rivulets around, which flowed from the east to the west. And you have the Aravalis in the south of Gurgaon. Then automatically the land is already sloping downwards, which means that as we look at the map, it's towards the north that you have the Najafgarh drain and all this water is supposed to drain out into that place. Unfortunately, what the real estate builders did is build something like the golf course road, which they did from the north to the south. So if you are going against the water current, obviously there are going to be problems. And that started happening very early on from the time that the road started getting built. Incidentally, since these plots were bought piecemeal, like I'm a farmer, I don't want to sell now. You might be a farmer who might be willing to sell. So my land is still protected. DLF hasn't bought my land, or probably a Raheja hasn't bought my land. But say a year later, I'll say, okay, I'll sell it, but I'll sell it to Raheja, not to DLF. So what happens is you have an island unto yourself. I am an island unto myself. And if DLF wants to connect three of us together, it has to go around particular property. There can't be a contiguous flow. So Gurgaon started getting built in this piecemeal kind of jigsaw puzzle kind of a format. So it had all these undulations which the land generally has. But if you go and build a straight road, wherever there's a dip, water is going to clog. So that is what is happening in multiple places in Gurgaon. And that is primarily where the problem is.
So it's a planning issue, essentially. They did not go about doing it in the right way?
Absolutely. Because so if you look at a map of Delhi, for instance, even if it is in the really crowded areas of East Delhi and there is very high density, there is still a certain grid, a certain way that, there is a certain plan and a way that the roads meet. And even in Noida, for instance, it's all 90-degree turns that you will see in Noida. You don't see this haphazard upar niche kind of building that happens, which you see in Gurgaon. If you look at a Google Earth, you will actually see how haphazardly Gurgaon was built compared to, a Delhi or a Noida, which doesn't have that. That is because Delhi and Noida has land that was already acquired by the authorities and then they parcel it out. Gurgaon had the reverse happening, where they got the parcel land and they built wherever. And then if it was a stretch of land, probably you suddenly had a mall out of nowhere. And then you have some residences that come out of nowhere. And everything all the roads were not meant for the public. It was meant for a car to go there. So you have an 18-lane highway that they have given you. And that is the kind of barter that they did with the government to say, we'll give you 18-lane highway. You give us this plot of land. It's that kind of, not people-centric kind of planning that happened in Gurgaon. So Veena Goldenberg, she's an urban historian and feminist. In her book on Gurgaon, she talks about how Gurgaon's planning is like a hiccup. Just like how your hiccups are unplanned, you suddenly have a mall and then you may have a residence and then you may just have a movie theater or you may just have an open space. So that kind of unplanned way that a city is being developed is how Gurgaon is developed, sector by sector, unfortunately.
So Shiny, along with the fact that topography was not kept in mind, what could be some other reasons for the massive flooding that happens every monsoon?
Yes, there is. In fact, so while topography is a problem and while piecemeal planning is a problem, there's also a problem of drainage. And the expert I was talking to, Suptendu Biswas, who's also written a book, Gurugram, How Gurgaon Turned to Gurugram. In that, he talks about how the need for over-engineering or over-concretization has also led to something like this. So you're putting in too many concrete pipes. All your stormwater drains are all concrete, because of which there is no percolation. So if there is a pool of water that is there, it's not going to percolate in a way that it can reach the groundwater. Concrete will automatically prevent groundwater from seeping below. And concretization has happened earlier. We used to have these mud paths along the roads. Today, everything is concrete, including very recently, I saw a flyover that was just getting done in Gurgaon. And at the end of the flyover, someone sensibly at that point has put a small drain so that, water doesn't get clogged. Recently, when I went there, that drain has been concretized. So obviously, you're not going to be able to have water seeping in anywhere. And that primarily leaves, and because of the way that there are dips and curves in the entire land, you are not taking into consideration where these waterlogging areas are happening. So it's primarily a problem of too much of concretization and not thinking of how the water actually should flow through the roads.
And in your story, you mentioned that Gurgaon doesn't have a groundwater reserve of its own. And so with all this concretization, it doesn't even stand a chance of developing one. But then the question is, how do we find a solution to this problem? What can we do to stop this from happening every year?
So one thing that's wonderful about Gurgaon is that their civic communities are very strong. So there is this group that came together to say that, okay, let's just do one part of making Gurgaon better, or rather creating a kind of a green patch so that simple things can be done. So one is, of course, the Aravali Biodiversity Park, as we all know, it has happened, where an abandoned mine was converted into this beautiful biodiversity park with a lot of native planting. So that has become a green sponge in that way. Another one project is there's a 5-kilometer stretch between Shakarpur, which is towards the north of Gurgaon, towards Wazirabad, towards the south of Gurgaon, which is now connected through a pathway. Now that pathway, which was once upon a time actually an irrigation canal, which was built as a way to absorb all this flood water. And this kind of canals you see everywhere in other parts of the country as well. Like in Chennai, you have the Buckingham Canal. In Kochi, you have the Mulasheri Dam Canal. So all these irrigation canals were meant to be places where water would be absorbed. Any rainwater, it would flow into these canals and it would become the place which fed into the irrigation agricultural land. Now, this Chakarpur to Wazirabad kind of stretch that is there, it now has a bund that allows for the water to flow. And they've created these drains, these mud drains, or what is called as French drains, which has gravel and then percolated pipes, which allow the water to flow into the ground. So this is one way that civic society has come together to allow for these kind of, interventions in the city. So that is one great way of doing it. The other thing that while talking to Suptendu, he said is that you manage the gradient of the roads. So ensure that your roads are sloping in such a way that the water trickles, like what happens in the hills. The roads automatically take the water down. So that requires a lot of understanding, surveying of the land that has to happen, which again quite often doesn't happen. But if you do that right, you will probably be able to minimize the flooding.
So this would apply to the future roads. But what about the ones that already exist? What can be done for them?
So for the ones that are there, what some places they're already doing is, like, especially in these road dividers or these pavements, they are creating these swalls, what they're called as, it's kind of a green area that is there probably wherever you see these greenery and people are beautifying pavements and side of your streets and all that. There now they are creating these kind of swells where water is allowed to percolate into the ground itself. So you can still do that. So if you create these swells, it automatically, and these can be underground, these can be long, linear, they're just there below your pavement. So if you do something like that, and if you do it like for say 10 kilometers, Gurgaon doesn't get that much of rain. It hardly gets some 600 mm of rain in a year. So it's very easy to be able to handle this if it's done intelligently. So yeah, that's basically what's required at the moment.
And next we turn our attention to the Indian economy. Earlier this month, the government put out a press release which made a rather surprising claim. It said, India not only is the world's fourth largest economy, but also one of the most equal societies today. The government cited data from the World Bank's latest poverty and equity brief and pointed to India's Gini index, an indicator of equality, which it said stood at 25.5. Now that would make India the fourth most equal country in the world after the Slovak Republic, Slovenia and Belarus. Now this claim raised a lot of eyebrows, especially because it runs counter to several reports suggesting that inequality in India has actually been growing. So to understand how the government is making this claim and why it's being questioned by the academics and observers, my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaks to the Indian Express's Udit Misra.
Udit, many of our listeners won't be familiar with this, so tell us what the Gini index is and how does it measure inequality?
So the Gini index is a very popular measure of inequality. It's not necessarily the best measure for inequality. The last 50 years, there's been demand for putting, as one academician wrote in the paper, putting the Gini back in the bottle. But Gini basically is about a simple presumption that if all the income in an economy is equally distributed, then 10% of the economy will have 10% of the income. And if you take 50% of the economy, it will have 50% of the income, and 100% of the economy will have 100% of the income. So if you can think, if listeners can imagine a square and then a diagonal line dividing the square, then that's what it looks like, that line, straight line, which shows that at any point you can drop down and you can find that 50% of the population has 50% of the income. And that's broadly the idea with the Gini index. Now, if for any economy, if you map that line, it would obviously not be exactly on that hypotenuse, that 45-degree line. It would be some variation of it. And because, there will be inequality in most societies, and whatever is the deviation, the gap between, whatever line you have created now and the 45-degree line is the measure of inequality.
So that straight line that you're talking about, that would be like a really equal society.
Yeah, that's a very equal society, and it's sort of an impossibility, but that's an equal society. And however much you stray from that, whatever loop you make away from that 45-degree line, that area between the line and the loop that you've made is essentially a measure of inequality. And this has been the index that has been used for a very long time, but there are issues with Gini index, which we'll come to.
And the government, while saying that India is one of the most equal societies today, it quoted data from the World Bank Poverty and Equity Brief and the Gini Index. So tell us what these two things are telling us and whether this claim is justified.
Yeah, so see, the fallacy in the argument of what the government is claiming is that if you look at what government is quoting, it has given only half a quotation from the World Bank brief. It has not given the full quote. So government has essentially cherry-picked data and given an incomplete picture. So in my piece for the Indian Express, I gave the full paragraph that the World Bank had given. And if you read that, you'll understand that the World Bank says that the Gini index has fallen, so inequality has fallen, and then puts a comma and says, though inequality may be underestimated due to data limitations.
So the government, while saying this, did not mention that the World Bank is flagging that there are data limitations here.
Yes. So the first problem was that it didn't give the full thing that, this might be underestimating. The second thing was that India has a consumption-based Gini index. That is what the World Bank says. And that is true because, you can look at this. The index can be typically made by using income data, right? That 50% of the population should have 50% of the income, right? But India doesn't capture income data. None of our surveys capture income data.
Right, we only capture consumption.
We capture consumption, right? So now the intricate part here is that the variation in consumption, the inequality in consumption between the whole population is lower than the variation in income. Think of it like this, that, as you grow richer, more and more your income goes into saving, not in actual consumption of things, right? There's only so much food you can eat. So yes, there is a variation between what a poor man eats and what a rich man eats. But that variation is nothing in comparison to what a rich man actually earns and what a poor man actually earns. So when you look at a Gini index based on consumption, it necessarily underestimates the inequality. Now, all other countries to whom India is comparing, what the government is claiming, use income Gini. We are using consumption Gini. The World Bank says that. But our government has not highlighted this fundamental difference that A, it is a consumption-based Gini index. B, the World Bank itself says that we have data limitations because of the way we conduct our consumption surveys.
And Udit, how hard is it for surveys to actually capture inequality? Because I'm guessing there would be limitations when it comes to how accurately they can measure the gap between the rich and the poor, right?
That is true. So that is another level of disagreement that a lot of academics have with just looking at Gini, that you often look at Gini using survey data, but surveys are known to be inefficient in capturing the richer population. For example, what are the chances of any survey in India, actually going to the richest man in India, the second richest, the third richest, the fourth richest, or the first 15 rich or 50 rich people in India to be part of that survey, the chances are fairly low. So if you're not capturing their consumption, their income, you are naturally underestimating inequality, because as it is witnessed in India, it is at the extremes where the inequality is expanding. The poor and the rich at the absolute extreme, those limits are being stretched, not necessarily the middle part. And there is something very slightly more technical on surveys, is that often rich do not want to come out and say or participate in such surveys, right? Whereas the poor might say, I have only so much money, they might be raising a complaint and want to share that thing. The rich who are better off or making more money from previous years may want to just hold back giving that information. So surveys typically underestimate inequality again. And there is a way to solve this, but surveys per se underestimate inequality.
Okay, so one limitation is that we don't have data on incomes, and the other is about surveys themselves. So how does one go about measuring inequality effectively in India? And also, on what basis are we saying that inequality seems to be growing in the country?
So, Gini index is one way of looking at inequality, but that's not the only way to look at inequality. Another economist, Chilean economist, had suggested something called the Palmer ratio, named after him, which is basically, look at the extremes, look at the incomes of the bottom 40, 50% and compare it to the incomes of the top 10%, 1%, right? And that's a fairly intuitive way to understand inequality. We all, when we think about inequality, we can imagine that if the rich are getting richer and the gap between the ultimate rich or the top 10% and the bottom 50% is expanding, we would say that there is a heightened inequality. So if you look at some other ratios like that and do the other tweak to cover for the gaps that are there in survey data, which is to look at, say, income tax data, which is more efficient in capturing the rich population, right? Because it is the rich who come under the income tax net. Not everybody pays income tax in India, but the rich definitely get captured in the income tax net. So you look at survey data and you add to that the income tax data and gel it technically and look at ratios like the Palmer ratio or something similar, bottom 50% and top 10% or top 1%, then you immediately get a very intuitively clear sense of what is happening to inequality in India. And that is what something like the World Inequality Database does. And they find that the numbers are fairly grim for India. There you'll find that the inequality in India is now higher than what it was in any time in recorded history, even the colonial rule. And if you look at income inequality, for example, the latest data points suggest that the top 1% account for 23% of total income, top 1% of India, and the bottom 50% account for only 15%, right? That is the level at which inequality is in India, if you were to do all these things to sort of set it right. So, if you calculate Gini index also using this kind of data tweaks to fill up the gap, that Gini index also goes up, frankly. Then the Gini index has actually gone up in a very substantial manner. Again, something that the World Bank mentions, but the government did not pick.
And also, Udit, the other countries that rank higher than India in the Gini index are Slovak Republic, Slovenia, and Belarus. Anything that stands out to you about that?
So, these are all very complicated calculations. Part of it has to do with their communism roots. These are names which come from a time when they were part of, left-wing governments and those kind of rules. So that is part of it. And how it affects is that many of the economies in Europe, which rank very high on equality, are not necessarily high on equality on their own. It is after the government action of taxation that they become more equal, right? So same economy might be more unequal, right? But then the government taxes and then redistributes and then it becomes more equal, right? Which is the whole point with many of these government actions of social welfare. So both those things matter, the historical roots and also government action.
And in the end, we talk about the passing of one of Kerala's tallest political figures, Comrade VS Achuthanandan. The former Chief Minister and founding member of the CPIM passed away on Monday at the age of 101. He passed away at a hospital in Thiruvananthapuram, where he had been on life support since suffering a cardiac arrest last month. He had largely stepped away from public life after a stroke in 2019. Achuthanandan was one of the 32 leaders who walked out of the undivided Communist Party in 1964 to form the CPIM. Over a political career that spanned nearly 8 decades, he became an icon of resistance and a key face of the left in Kerala. He served as Chief Minister from 2006 to 2011, leading the CPIM-headed Left Democratic Front or LDF to a sweeping victory. He also served as leader of opposition for 3 terms. But VS, as he was popularly known, was much more than a party man. He was a grassroots organizer, an anti-corruption crusader, a civil society conscience keeper, and a rebel within his own ranks. Born in 1923 in Alappuzha, he lost both parents early and dropped out of school after class 7. He began working at his brother's tailoring shop, where informal political debates sparked his interest. At 17, he joined the Communist Party and soon started mobilizing workers in coir factories and toddy tapping communities. He also played a prominent role in the 1946 militant communist movement against the Travancore monarchy and was later arrested and spent nearly 5 years in jail. During his political career, he steadily rose through the ranks to become the state secretary of the CPIM in the 1980s. In 2011, he led the LDF in a tight election. And in 2016, at the age of 92, he campaigned once again, though the party eventually picked up Pinarayi Vijayan as Chief Minister. VS was given cabinet rank and made chairman of the Administrative Reforms Commission. He remained an MLA from Malampuza until 2021 and leaves behind a legacy that shaped modern Kerala politics. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank, Bhargava and me, Niharika, Nanda. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.